Hello, this is the non-dual lectionary for the fifth Sunday after Pentecost in year A. We're continuing on with Matthew. We're actually picking up right where we left off last week. This is a short one for this week, so let's just get right to it. It is Matthew chapter 10, verses 40 through 42. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. So two things jump out at me, and we'll see how far I spin out on this one. The first is just, some of this, we're in Matthew now, but this is reminiscent of some of the things in John that we talked about several weeks ago with, just in my mind, Jesus having this recognition of his of true nature, of the non-dual nature, right? Of whatever you call the divine is not separate from myself, is not separate from everything else. The apparent boundary between myself and everything else is a creation, right? Of the self's way of looking at things, the mind's way of looking at things. Doesn't mean it's false, but it's not true. It's not the real nature of things, right? It's not what really is. It's a construct of overlaid of what is. And so then it's not that the construct isn't part of that either, right? But the construct is recognized as a construct in any event. So the first one, right? Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me, right? The me being like Jesus recognizing that his self is sent from reality, the divine, true nature, what is and manifesting as what is, and that you, right, the disciples here, but even bigger than that, right, is like that's not separate from that either, right? There's in my mind a bit of Jesus struggling to articulate his recognition in the context of the Hebrew scriptures, right? And this is where I spin out a bit because there's something about that awakening experience, and not just the awakening. I call it experience, right? Not just the glimpse of awakening, right? But then living that out and realizing it, recognizing it as fundamental identity that um, might be clearer in a sense in some other traditions, right? Like the teachings can be a little more direct about like this is what it's like or do this, right? Whereas in the Christian tradition, coming out of the Jewish tradition, it gets overlaid onto like this idea of, God, having a covenant with humanity and then the messianic idea of God and man, um, that Jesus then from what I can see, sees as his true nature, right? As expressing his recognition, right? So when we read in, Moses, God saying, I am that I am, tell them I am sent you, like the true being, like pure being the nature of the divine. And Jesus recognizes pure being as his own nature as well, and then sees those as one and the same in that context, right? But having a bit of a struggle of articulating that in that context because it isn't maybe as clean as, say, in a Buddhist tradition, right? Of like, hey, um, the cessation of desire, right? And is like the recognition of like one's Buddha nature, something like that. And then the Christian tradition overlays on top of that, even more, right? Where Jesus is then set aside as uniquely different from everyone else. Um, and again, if you've listened to me enough in these, like I don't think Jesus himself is really saying that, because again, we get this interpenetrating language, right? That again, that I think is can be recognized, right? By if you've got even a glimpse of the experience yourself, and also if you hear that from other in other articulations, other traditions, or other teachers, you can see then like, oh, that's what Jesus is articulating here too, right? In different language and different context, all of that. But in any event, then that was just one line, and like I said, I would spin out a bit maybe. Um, but again, like the not unique necessarily, but the emphasis that we get from Jesus maybe that doesn't necessarily come from other traditions as cleanly is like that manifesting true nature in the world, right? Not just recognize true nature, um, even non-dual, right? In that sense of like, hey, what don't we typically get is sort of that transcendent view, right? Or that separation view, or that pure being view, separate from or separate from, but seemingly separate from manifesting in the world, right? And the non-dual recognition kind of sees all that as one and the same ultimately, right? But sometimes there can be that first step of like seeing that apparent separation, which is why we talk about the non-dual as like breaking that down and all that. But in any event, what we get from the Christian tradition, I think, again, more emphasis than in many others, is this like manifesting that in the world, right? Um, so Jesus is always saying, not, escape to this other realm, or, rest in pure being totally and don't do anything, right? But it always becomes this, welcoming a prophet in the name of a prophet, give a cup of cold water to one of the little ones, right? And they won't, none of these will lose their reward. Well, what's the reward here? The prophet's reward, the reward of the righteous. What does that mean, right? Um, and and you can read this in two ways in this section in particular, right? The one way is that Jesus is saying like, hey, the real reward here, right? Like, is this ultimately like just living out, what is, recognizing and then living out what is, like going where life goes, because ultimately that's what is happening. But when we can kind of be along for the ride consciously, right? Like we are along, we are on the ride, but but when we're consciously like, you know, not even participating in, because that's happening already too, but just like resting along the way as it's happening, then the reward is always what's coming along, right? But you can also read this as like, hey, you'll get the prophet's reward or the righteous award, which maybe you can read as something separate from what he's talking about, right? Of like, you'll get the reward that like you're going to get, and go ahead and see what that is, right? Um, and again, in that, like maybe, like like whenever I go back to Jesus's words himself, at least, what gets written down through the tradition already, like there's already decades before this gets written down, but there's like there's this subtlety to the teaching, right? Um, that that isn't as direct as some other wisdom tradition, and maybe is a little bit more difficult to parse out. And as we can see, kind of gets this overlay in the tradition that like does something totally different from a non-dual waking up instruction or anything like that. But I wonder, if maybe the subtlety in the teaching is like a time bomb, right? Of like, if we could really sink into that and really take it in, um, you know, what does it mean to, whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and who welcomes the one who sent me, and whoever welcomes the prophet gets the prophet's reward. And if you really just kind of sit back with that, of like, what reward is coming based on who am I welcoming? Um, that the easy place to go, I think, is the ego self, the psychological self, right? Of like, what do I want and who do I want to be with and what comes back to me? And there's like truth to that, right? Deep truth to that. But there's also this like subtle, like, um, the reward that you're getting is already gotten, right? Like, um, not like a cause and effect, but like you've already received whatever you're going to receive. And if you can open your eyes to it, right? Let those who have eyes see, let those who have ears hear, then you know what already is always here and enough, and there's something so cool about that. So I just, I always this is just such a little passage, and you can spin it out in all this way, but I just wonder, the subtlety that comes through sometimes. Jesus can be very direct, I bring the sword and not, not peace, but also like sometimes it's like these little seeds, these little time bombs, like, I wonder what we do with that. So I think a cool one.